All right, as promised, let's try now to just talk about the BELA Bill. Of course, it's being signed into law on Friday. There's a public signing ceremony there by President Cyril Ramaphosa that is expected to take place at the Union Buildings. There are some concerns that are being raised by some of you even as well tonight. So let's try and get some answers and also speak about just how far does it go to try and address some of the critical challenges that are being faced in the sector. Professor Mary Metcalfe, UJ education specialist, joins us live now for this conversation. Prof, good afternoon to you and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Let's just start first with, there's been mixed reaction today when the announcement was made that Friday there's going to be a public signing ceremony. Some aren't happy about it, but others are saying it's a step in the right direction. Your take?
Well, I think we must first of all just look at the legal position. The Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill has now passed through both houses of Parliament and been adopted. And it was adopted by the second house to adopt it was the National Council of Provinces, and that was in May of this year. So several months have passed. Now the President is in the position where the Constitution requires him to sign a bill into law unless he has reservations about the constitutionality of the bill. And he would generally take advice from lawyers, constitutional experts on the constitutionality. Once he is been assured that there's no constitutional problems, then he's actually obliged to not delay in passing it into law. So I think we can all assume that the legal advice is that this is constitutional and he therefore has an obligation to sign. The timing of the signing, he may have some flexibility. But if you look, Bongi, at the elements of the bill around which there was the most controversy, and I'll just say what they are and then you can decide which of those you want to talk about. So firstly, the making grade R compulsory, which means all children will have to go to school from the age of the year in which they turn 6. The second component is linked to that because once education is compulsory, the state is obliged to make sure that there's places for all children. And that comes to the issue of who makes the policy around what language is taught at schools. And then the third area around which there was some discussion is homeschooling.
And I'd like us to start right where you started because it's one of the big questions, the grade R being compulsory for all. You're seeing some of those who are opposed to it. For example, I'll take the Democratic Alliance. They say that, the Department of Basic Education does not have the 12 billion rand, which they say is needed to implement this for all learners. That is that figure correct? And when it comes into the burden that it puts on the system, can it cope?
Okay, so I can check the figure when I talk to you, but there is a substantial amount that is required to ensure that all children have a place in grade R. Where we are with the implementation of grade R in the country is that it's about 97% of children who are already attending grade R. Some of the amount that's required is to make sure that there's proper classrooms and facilities. The largest amount is because once grade R is compulsory, the state will have the obligation to actually pay the teachers' salaries. So the annual costs of the teachers' salaries of grade R is considerable. And those costs must be met from the budgets of the provinces. So it is correct that particularly in the National Council of Provinces, the DA raised concern about making grade R compulsory. Now, if you look at practice across the world and on the continent, making it 10 years of compulsory education actually brings us into line with the continent and with international norms. There will be a challenge in terms of meeting that bill, but if it sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money, but we also need to remember that annually the amount of money that we spent across the country on basic education over the last 3 years has been well in excess of 500 billion. So the scale of the additional costs is going to require reprioritization.
So
Earlier, sorry.
Pardon me for coming in there. There's a view as well. You talk about the language policy. And there are some who are saying that, especially when you read, the bill, it talks about how the HOD is going to be critical in this process when it comes to approving, some of what is put in front of him as an admission or even a language policy. So now, there are those who are saying, but why are you trying to take away the powers from the school governing bodies? But then others are saying, you're actually not. You are now harmonizing that these two entities actually work together in a much more collaborative, form. Does it harmonize or does it take away the powers of the SGBs?
Okay. This is what I think requires substantive discussion in the conversations that are going to be happening politically and across the country. There is no change to what has already been in legislation since 1996. What the BELA Bill does is to put into place procedures that must be followed. Now, why are those procedures important? The original South African Schools Act of 1996 said that school governing bodies may determine the language policy, provided there's no form of discrimination. Subsequently, there have been multiple court cases where, firstly, sometimes the state has been overruled because they didn't really follow a thorough and careful process. The principle that has been established is that because these are public schools, the state has the responsibility to make sure that all children who are in a particular locality have access to a school, and therefore the state can override. Now, if you look at BELA, it is so detailed now in terms of the procedures that must be followed. Every school governing body must submit the language policy. If the HOD, and let's just be realistic, this will be delegated to officials, they will then return it to the school governing body with recommendations, and there's criteria. The policy must take into account the needs of the broader community, must be in the best interests of the child. There must be enough classroom space. There must be enough resources. But it doesn't stop there. If the HOD does that and then still decides the school needs to have, for example, 2 languages, which is often the case, he can overrule the school, but he has to inform the school governing body. He has to make sure that every child gets a notice that informs the parents. He's got to give them a reasonable opportunity to make representations. He's got to conduct public hearings. He's then got to go back to the school governing body and inform them of the decisions, and he's got to take all of the necessary steps to make sure that the resources are there.
That's quite interesting, and also something that you said as well, interesting around the delegation of work to the officials as well, because this is one of the areas of concern, because some are saying that how do you then hand over the administrative function to this one individual, because it's going to be burdensome on them. So you are saying that it's actually realistically going to be a group effort. It's not going to be a one-person effort.
Absolutely. If you take a province like KwaZulu-Natal, there are 12,000 schools in the province. One man, one woman, maybe one woman could, but no person can approve all of that. Now, what's important about all of this is the reason we have laws is because we have courts that can review the process to make sure it's fair. The BELA Bill now makes all of the stipulations absolutely clear to the public and to the officials. If the department in any way infringes these processes that are spelled out in law, it would mean that if they were taken to court, they would lose. So it binds the department to reviewable decisions that are fair, procedurally thorough.
Quite interesting. And your take on the regulation of the homeschooling sector?
Okay, so the regulation of the homeschooling sector is also very interesting because the provision for homeschooling has existed before. What it now does is tighten the conditions which I believe are in the best interests of learners. So, for example, if you are going to homeschool your child and then get your child to apply to write the National Senior Certificate, the matric, there is an obligation that's now on the parent, supported by the department, to make sure that the child is able to comply with all of the requirements of the NSC. Have they submitted the year marks? Have they completed all of those requirements? And I think that that's necessary because many people are not teachers but may wish to educate their children at home. Where that is the case, then there needs to be guidance to the parents. And because education is compulsory, it also means that there's an obligation on the state to make sure that children are protected and there isn't a child who spends many years perhaps doing the wrong thing when they need to be supported.
Quite an interesting take. I wish we had the whole evening just to unpack some sections here in order to really just try and break it down for our viewers. But certainly what you've said to us is very helpful. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I appreciate it. That was the professor of, in fact, she's a UJ education specialist, Professor Mary Metcalfe.